اسمحوا لي بعد إذن حضراتكم إن احنا نقدم دكتور ليز جودوين رئيس مجلس بلدية لندن الرئيس الشرفي للمؤتمر. دكتور you are welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me today. You see that okay?
Yes.
Brilliant. So thank you very much for the invitation to join you today. It's a great pleasure to be with you. And now it's a really important time to be thinking about the sustainability of the food system. If we think a little bit about the context that we're living in, there are three big things that are all happening at the same time. We've got increasing evidence of climate change. We've got the ongoing effects of COVID-19, and we've got the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So those are very big things hitting our world. And that's all resulting in changing weather patterns, energy price rises, food price rises and shortages, fertilizer price spikes, and shocks and disruption to the food supply chains. And that means that it's really important that we make our food system as sustainable as it can be. And if we just remind ourselves of some of the figures, we waste or lose roughly a third of all the food between production and our plates. It costs nearly $1 trillion every year. It represents around 8% of greenhouse gas emissions. So at a time when we're trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, that's really significant. And it means we're wasting a quarter of all the water used in agriculture. And it is a problem across the whole supply chain. So it happens right through from the farm with crops that are left in the field during harvesting or lack of efficient harvesting techniques, all the way through the supply chain, so it can be degraded or not stored or transported properly. There can be losses when you're processing the food. There may be problems with quality or lack of markets. And then all of us waste food in our households. And the latest figures are that roughly 14% is lost during the harvesting and supply chain. And then we as householders waste around 17%. So the figures are really quite shocking when we've got global food shortages. And if it was a country, food loss and waste would be the third largest greenhouse gas emitter after China and the United States, and that is still the case. So it means that it is a big ticket item, and with COP coming up in November, it's really important that food loss and waste is on the agenda. And as I said, we've equally we're throwing away 1 billion tons of food while we've got around 1 in 9, 1 in 10 globally who are malnourished and don't manage to get a sustainable diet. Huge benefits of reducing food loss and waste. Social, it improves food security clearly for a growing population. It allows us to feed hungry people now. Environmental, the greenhouse gas emissions are really significant, but also the water and land, the amount of land that's used and then wasted essentially because we waste all the food is the size of China. And then economic, we're wasting $1 trillion every year, which is crazy when so much of the world is bordering on recession. And we have SDG 12.3, which is clearly aimed at focusing on food loss and waste, which is the objective to halve food waste at the retail and consumer levels by 2030 and reduce food losses. And I'm obviously a champion for SDG 12.3, and our overall strategy for achieving that goal is Target, Measure, Act. And it's a really simple strategy. It applies across the whole of the supply chain. If you set your target, you set your ambition to achieve SDG 12.3, it sets your ambition and that motivates action. It says you think it's important. And then measurement is absolutely fundamental because what gets measured gets managed. As soon as you start measuring, you see where your problems are, and you can then take action to address those problems and reduce the overall loss or waste. And it drives the action, which is ultimately what matters across the whole supply chain. So how are we doing? The SDGs were set back in 2015, and we're only 8 years away now from 2030. There really has been there are signs of action. Not enough, I would say, but there are signs of action. We're seeing some quite good action by businesses in the supply chain. with initiatives like 10 by 20 by 30, where you get 10 big retail type organizations to work with their top 20 suppliers to all halve food waste by 2030. And you can see you get a multiplier effect. So there are clear signs of momentum happening in the supply chain. IKEA was the first company this year. In September, they announced that they had halved food waste across their operations. Tesco is at 45%. So we're seeing some good progress among individual companies. There are also signs of government action, which is really encouraging. The EU has a very clear roadmap. They're going to start reporting figures for all EU countries this year. China has really upped its game and increased the focus on food loss and waste in the last year or so, and they're about to start consistent measurement. The USA has announced huge amounts of funding going into areas including food loss and waste, which is really encouraging to see. And there are others. I mean, Australia has also made it far more on their agenda. So there are signs of government action, nowhere near enough. There are too many very big population countries who are still not doing enough. Maybe cite India and Brazil and some of other Latin American countries. I think we've got far greater consistency in measurement. So we've got the UNEP Food Waste Index and the FAO Food Loss Index, which are all consistent with the Food Loss and Waste Protocol, which we published back in 2015. And there's an ISO standard being developed, which I chair the committee that's working on that. So we're getting much more consistency, which will allow us to look globally at the figures and how we're doing. And some other highlights, we recently in September, we published a consumer behaviour change guide. So that's for any organisation wanting to engage consumers to reduce food waste at home, putting together all the existing best practice. And we're seeing an increase in focus on farmers and post-harvest losses. So Olam, for example, working with its farmers to try to reduce the losses that happen at farm, and in some cases improving productivity by about 50%. As champions, we have this roadmap to say, are we making any progress towards 2030? And every 3 years we have milestones in that roadmap, and we assess the progress using a traffic light system. And the second column here shows the traffic lights that we've just published in September, which is our assessment for the end of 2021. And you'll see it's a bit of a mixed bag. There are a few green highlights in there, around measurements, in particular from companies, and around action by companies. So you can see that companies are doing better than governments. So running across the x-axis, you've got target, measure, act, and then that's split into governments and companies. So unfortunately, governments are still red, and yellow, but companies are yellow, green, and green. So we are seeing some progress, although we would clearly like to see far more. And if I think then about what we need next, I mean, we need companies in particular to grow the supply chain engagement. We also need more of them to report publicly. There is good evidence that a lot of companies are starting to measure, but they're not publishing their results. One has to think it's probably because they want to get their house in order before they publish their results, but it would be very helpful if they actually started publishing and we could do more benchmarking. And we need more companies to engage with the farmers and to engage with consumers, because they have a huge role to play in helping us all reduce food loss and waste. And governments, we need far more measurement at country level. We need far more bold strategies and programs. And we need more inclusion in nationally determined contributions, more recognition of the importance of food loss and waste at events like COP27, and recognising the link between food security and food loss and waste. So overall, I think there's a greater need for recognition of that link between greenhouse gas emissions and food security, particularly important at the moment when we've got food shortages. But we also need to do far more at both ends of the supply chain, so at the farmers with farm loss and with consumers, because those are two ongoing hotspots that, unless we take further action, we will not achieve our goals of halving food waste, which is increasingly vital to help protect the environment, but also to help ensure that people get food from a sustainable food system. Thank you very much.
Thank you دكتور ليز جودوين رئيس مجلس بلدية لندن الرئيس الشرفي للمؤتمر. Thank you دكتور ليز.